One man once controlled more than 1% of the entire American economy, all by himself. 96 years after he died, over 100 of his own descendants crowded into a single room, and not one of them was a millionaire. That man was Cornelius Vanderbilt, and this is the story of how the largest private fortune America had ever produced simply disappeared. Let's talk numbers first because they matter here. When Cornelius Vanderbilt died in 1877, he left behind roughly $100 million. Adjust that figure for plain inflation, and you land somewhere around $2 to $3 billion in today's money, which sounds almost unimpressive by modern billionaire standards. But that measurement badly understates what he actually had. The fairer way to compare an old fortune to a modern one is to measure it against the total size of the economy at the time, then scale that share up to match the size of the economy today. Using that method, Vanderbilt's fortune comes out to somewhere north of $185 billion in today's terms. By the time his son had finished building on top of it, the family fortune at its peak is estimated at around $200 billion. Both numbers are technically true. One tells you what his money could buy, the other tells you how much power it actually represented. And by that second measure, almost no private individual in American history has ever come close to matching him. Here's the part of this story that genuinely stings once you sit with it. Nobody stole this fortune. It wasn't wiped out in some sudden market crash. There was no scandal, no crime, no single catastrophic event you could point to. It was simply the largest private fortune America had ever created, and within 3 generations, it had completely evaporated. The mansions were torn down, the cash was gone, a family name that had once meant more raw wealth than almost anyone else on the planet became, instead, the textbook example of exactly how fast a fortune can die. So, how does that actually happen? How does a family go from the richest in the entire country to essentially nothing in less time than a single long human lifetime? The answer isn't bad luck. It's a mistake so common among wealthy families that it has earned its own well-known saying, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. And the Vanderbilts may be the single purest example of that pattern the country has ever produced. They had every possible advantage, except the one thing that actually keeps a fortune alive across generations. Here's the detail that makes this whole story genuinely painful. On his deathbed, Cornelius Vanderbilt gave his heirs exactly one instruction. Keep the fortune together. Do not split it up. Do not scatter it across dozens of hands. Hold it as one single block. It was the single most important order he ever gave his family, and it turned out to be the one instruction they could not wait to ignore. To really understand what they eventually threw away, you first have to understand the man who built it in the first place, because absolutely nobody simply handed Cornelius Vanderbilt anything. He was born in 1794 on Staten Island, the son of a working ferryman, and he went to work on the water himself as a young boy. He started with a single boat, then he built a small fleet, then he moved into steamships, and he ran the whole operation with a level of ruthlessness that genuinely terrified the people around him. By his 40s, he owned one of the largest steamship operations anywhere in the country, carrying passengers up and down the American coastline, and after the gold rush of 1849, all the way out toward California by way of Nicaragua. His preferred business tactic was simple and brutal. Find a route where someone else was making good money, launch a competing line right beside it, then slash his own fares until the rival either paid him handsomely to go away or simply collapsed under the pressure. He got rich again and again by being paid to leave. That approach made him feared, ferocious, and enormously wealthy. And remarkably, he hadn't even reached the business that would eventually triple his entire fortune. That business was still ahead of him, riding on iron rails. When he eventually moved into railroads, he did it the exact same way he did everything else in his life, through sheer force. He would buy up a railroad, and then, whenever a dispute arose, he would simply refuse to let a connecting rival line's trains cross his own bridge into the city, stranding thousands of passengers until the other side finally gave in and came to terms. It was raw, it was aggressive, and it worked every single time. By the end of his railroad career, he did not merely own a collection of railroads, he owned the exact choke point that every single rival was eventually forced to pass through, and he set whatever price he wanted for that privilege. That is genuinely how you build a fortune worth more than 1% of an entire nation's economy. It takes a very particular kind of person, relentless, completely unsentimental, forever hunting for the next available advantage. And it is precisely the kind of hard, hands-on, take no prisoners work that not one of his heirs would ever choose to do again. They would go on to inherit the choke point itself, but they would never fully grasp why it was valuable in the first place, or how to properly defend it going forward. They would simply collect the tolls, generation after generation, right up until the tolls eventually ran out entirely. When business rivals tried to squeeze him financially, he would cut his own fares below theirs until they finally broke under the pressure. When a pair of business partners tried cheating him while he happened to be away traveling, he sent them a written letter that has followed his name across 2 full centuries since. Gentlemen, you have undertaken to cheat me. I will not sue you, for the law is too slow. I will ruin you. And then he genuinely did exactly that. That single letter captures the entire man in one line. No business partner he couldn't eventually break. No rival he wouldn't happily undercut. No rule he ever felt personally bound by. He had almost no formal schooling, virtually no interest in polite society or charitable causes, and he built the largest private business empire in the entire country using nothing more than raw nerve and relentless appetite. People genuinely hated him, and people genuinely feared him, and in both cases, they were entirely correct to feel that way. But whatever else you might say about Cornelius Vanderbilt, he understood exactly how his own money had been made, down to the very last dollar, because he had personally made every single one of those dollars himself, starting from one small boat. That particular knowledge, the deep, lived understanding of exactly how a fortune gets built, is the one thing that would not survive him into the next generation. People called him the Commodore because of his steamship empire, but the truly enormous money came later, and it came from a completely different machine entirely, the railroad. Starting in the 1860s, well into his own late 60s, an age when most men are already thinking about retirement, Vanderbilt moved decisively into rail and began systematically buying up the various lines surrounding New York City. He acquired the Harlem Line, then the Hudson River Line, and eventually the truly massive prize, the New York Central, stitching all of them together into one unified system. Along the way, he built Grand Central Depot, the direct ancestor of the terminal that still stands in New York City today. He effectively cornered every major route in and out of the biggest city in America, and from that position, he charged whatever price he pleased. The railroad, in that era, functioned essentially like the internet does today, the underlying network that everything else in the economy had to move across, and Vanderbilt owned the single most important stretch of it. Grain, coal, cattle, passengers, mail, every bit of it rode across his rails and paid his toll along the way. It was about the closest thing to a money printing machine that the 19th century economy ever produced, and he sat directly on top of it. This railroad empire is the real engine that generated the family's fortune. Keep that in mind, because the tragedy of the next 3 generations is that they inherited this machine and forgot it was even there, right up until they had spent everything it produced and let the machine itself rust away beneath them. And he fought dirty whenever the situation called for it. During the Erie War of 1868, Vanderbilt tried to buy up controlling ownership of the Erie Railway, and his rivals simply printed brand new shares of stock faster than he could buy them up, watering down the stock and openly bribing the New York State Legislature to make the scheme technically legal. It stands as one of the ugliest financial brawls of that century, and it taught Vanderbilt a lesson he had honestly already suspected, that the rules were meant for other people, not for him. By the time he died in 1877, at the age of 82, Cornelius Vanderbilt had assembled the single largest private fortune in the United States, somewhere around $100 million. To this day, measured against the economy of his own era, he still ranks as the second richest American who has ever lived, trailing only John D. Rockefeller. His fortune was so enormous that people at the time often claimed he personally held more available cash than the entire United States Treasury. That claim is difficult to verify against any actual ledger, and his fortune was in fact still somewhat smaller than the federal government's annual income at the time. But the comparison tells you roughly the scale we're talking about. One retired ferryman's son had come to personally control a meaningful slice of the entire American economy, a feat no private citizen before him had ever matched. And then, at the very end, he did the one genuinely smart thing every single one of his heirs would go on to completely fail to copy. He refused to divide the fortune. Cornelius left almost the entire estate to a single son, William Henry Vanderbilt. Roughly $95 million went directly to William and his own sons. His 8 daughters, along with his other son, received considerably less, some getting only a few $100,000 each, and several went on to formally contest the will for well over a year. Claiming their father had been insane or manipulated, they lost. The court fight was ugly and public, with 2 daughters and the disinherited son dragging the family through months of testimony about the old man's state of mind. But the Commodore's original wishes held firm. 95% of the greatest fortune in America went to one man, exactly as the father intended. And for one further generation, this approach genuinely worked. That is the cruel irony buried at the heart of this story. The move the Commodore made, concentrating the fortune in a single capable heir rather than splitting it up, actually does work as a strategy. It simply has to be repeated deliberately, every single generation, and the Vanderbilts only ever managed to do it once. The Commodore had done it on purpose. He had watched other fortunes shatter once divided among too many hands, and he was determined to keep his own empire intact. It was a brilliant, coldly calculated act of preservation. The trouble is that it was a single act, not an ongoing system. And that difference turns out to be the entire story in miniature. Because William Henry Vanderbilt, the son who inherited nearly everything, turned out to be a far better steward of the fortune than almost anyone around him had expected. Most people had quietly written him off as a dull, unremarkable farmer his father had constantly bullied. But once handed the empire, William actually doubled it. In under 9 years, he grew the original $100 million into more than $200 million, briefly making him, for a short period, the single richest man in the entire world. Sit with that for a moment. For a few years during the 1880s, the richest human being on the planet was a Vanderbilt, sitting on a fortune larger than what most national governments of the era controlled. There was no obvious ceiling in sight. If the family had simply continued doing what the Commodore and his son had already been doing, holding the fortune together, running the underlying business, and adding a bit more with each generation, there is no clear reason the Vanderbilts shouldn't still rank among the wealthiest families on Earth today, the same way the Rockefellers largely still do. All the raw material was there. What was missing was the ongoing will to protect it, and an actual plan to make that protection outlast any single person. William proved that the fortune could keep growing under the right stewardship. He was also, though nobody recognized it at the time, the very last Vanderbilt who would ever add meaningfully to the family fortune, rather than simply spend it down. William is also remembered for a line that stuck to the family name forever afterward. Pressed by a reporter about whether his railroad served the public interest, he is remembered for snapping back, "The public be damned." The exact wording is disputed by historians today, but the sentiment fit the family perfectly. But here's precisely where the family's discipline finally broke down. William Henry did not follow his own father's example. He did not concentrate the fortune in one capable heir. Instead, he split his roughly $200 million among his many children. And the moment that money fanned outward in all those separate hands, the machine his father had built to keep the fortune whole simply ceased to exist. The Commodore's one rule, keep it together, had lasted exactly one generation past his own death. Why did William break the very rule that had built the family fortune? Not out of foolishness, out of a genuine sense of fairness. He looked at his own children and couldn't bring himself to do what his father had done to his sisters, picking one favored heir and leaving everyone else with scraps. So he split the money among all of them, the way a loving parent naturally might. And in doing the kind thing, he did the fatal thing instead. The Commodore had grasped something cold his own son couldn't stomach, that a fortune divided among many hands is a fortune already on its way toward nothing. Here, kindness was the beginning of the end. And the generation that went on to inherit all of those individual pieces had absolutely no genuine interest in ferries or trains or building anything at all from scratch. They had something else in mind entirely. They were going to spend it. And they happened to inherit the perfect historical era in which to do exactly that. This was the Gilded Age, a period when American industry was minting brand new fortunes left and right, and older established families competed constantly to prove that theirs remained the grandest. For the Vanderbilt grandchildren, spending money lavishly wasn't treated as a vice. It was treated as their entire job. Their whole purpose, as they understood it, was simply to be magnificent, to throw the most memorable parties, own the largest houses, marry the grandest names, and set the standard the rest of society would chase. Nobody in that generation woke up thinking about how to add to the family fortune. They woke up thinking about how to be seen spending it. What followed became one of the most spectacular public displays of wealth in human history. And every dollar of it represented money leaving the family for good. The grandchildren of the Commodore didn't compete by building new businesses. They competed by building palaces instead. Up and down Fifth Avenue in New York City, they raised an entire row of mansions so enormous that newspapers of the era simply called it Vanderbilt Row, each grander than the last. Elaborate marble chateaus modeled after the great historic houses of Europe, staffed around the clock by armies of servants. Once Fifth Avenue had filled up, they built again in Newport, Rhode Island, referring to these massive estates as summer cottages, the way you might casually refer to a battleship as a small rowboat. The breakers alone contained 70 separate rooms and required a full staff of dozens just to run it. Marble House, next door, swallowed roughly $11 million in construction costs. $7 million of that spent purely on marble shipped over from Italy, for a house lived in only a few scattered weeks each year. These stood as the largest, most expensive private homes the country had ever seen, and the family threw them up as expensive toys, treating a fortune that had taken a lifetime to earn as though it could never run dry. It absolutely could run dry. It was already quietly running dry. They simply couldn't see it yet, because the remaining pile still looked so impressively tall from where they were standing. Every one of those marble palaces required dozens of live-in servants, tons of coal for heating, mountains of upkeep, and a tax bill that never stopped arriving, and not one of them ever brought in a single dollar of actual income. A working railroad throws off fresh cash every day it operates. A 100-room chateau only ever eats cash, endlessly. The family was steadily trading away the very thing that produced money in exchange for things that only consumed it, all while mistaking the size of each chateau for the size of their remaining fortune. Then there were the parties themselves. In 1883, Alva Vanderbilt threw an elaborate costume ball at her own Fifth Avenue chateau that cost roughly $250,000, a genuine fortune in itself at the time, with thousands of additional dollars spent purely on champagne, flowers, and costumes for a single evening. And that particular ball accomplished something else worth remembering too, because it's the exact point where this story briefly intersects with another famous Gilded Age family. Alva specifically used that party to force her way into elite New York high society, which had been firmly ruled for years by the Astor family, who had long dismissed the Vanderbilts as vulgar new money outsiders. In order to actually receive an invitation to the ball, the reigning queen of society herself eventually had to personally call on the Vanderbilts and formally recognize them as social equals. The Astors ultimately let the Vanderbilts in. Both families stood as the wealthiest of their entire era. Both families would eventually go on to lose almost all of it. Hold on to that particular detail because it captures the entire pattern of this story in one single handshake. The Vanderbilts had, by this point, essentially run out of things to purchase within America itself. So instead, they started buying things that simply cannot be built with money alone. Titles. Consider the story of Consuelo Vanderbilt, the Commodore's great-granddaughter and one of the saddest bargains in the family's history. Her mother, that same Alva from the costume ball, wanted a genuine European aristocrat brought into the family, and found one, Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, a man who owned a slowly crumbling ancestral palace called Blenheim and badly needed fresh cash to save it. It amounted to a straightforward trade. The Duke received desperately needed money. The Vanderbilts received a title. Consuelo herself did not want any part of this. She was already in love with someone else, and by her own family's later admission, her mother physically locked her in her bedroom until she agreed to the marriage. Alva would later testify, in a single sentence that captures the whole situation, "I forced my daughter to marry the Duke." On the 6th of November in 1895, Consuelo walked down the aisle weeping behind her veil. The settlement attached to her marriage came to roughly $2.5 million in railroad stock, handed directly over to a British duke to prop up an aging English palace, flowing straight out of the family fortune and straight out of the country. The marriage proved to be a genuine misery, and it was eventually annulled in 1926. The money never came back. And Consuelo's marriage wasn't some isolated exception. It was the broader family strategy, dressed up in a wedding gown. All throughout the Gilded Age, wealthy American heiresses were routinely married off to European aristocrats who had impressive titles but essentially no remaining cash. The Vanderbilts carried this out on an especially grand scale. They had taken a fortune built through hard American work and were spending it to purchase the one thing money couldn't build on its own, the outward appearance of old aristocratic blood. Every one of those bargains sent real capital out and brought back nothing more than a decorative coronet, and you cannot sustain a dynasty on decorative coronets alone. So take a step back and look at exactly what this third generation was actually doing with the greatest private fortune in America. Building palaces that only ever cost money, throwing parties that only ever burned through cash, shipping capital straight overseas to purchase titles that produced absolutely nothing in return. Nobody in that entire generation was actually running a functioning business. Nobody was adding a single new dollar to the family's holdings. They were simply living in extraordinarily grand style off a pile of money that had already stopped growing and a pile of money that isn't growing, while dozens of family members simultaneously spend from it only ever has one possible direction left to travel. And the pile had one more quiet leak that finished the job. Every generation the money got divided again. The Commodore had kept it concentrated in one pair of hands. William split it among several children. Those children split their own shares among their children. And so on, each division cutting every share smaller, while the family multiplied and the mansions kept eating money. There was no central family trust holding the capital as one unified block, no holding company, no dedicated family office running the entire fortune as a single enterprise. When you take the largest fortune in America and divide it, then divide it again, all while spending constantly and earning essentially nothing new, the math isn't complicated, it goes to zero eventually. Take Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt, a great-grandson of the Commodore. Born in 1880 into almost unimaginable wealth, he never worked a single day in his life. He gambled and drank heavily, burning through most of an inheritance worth roughly $25 million. According to family lore, on the night of his 21st birthday, he reportedly lost $70,000 at the card table before morning. He drank himself to death at 45. By the time he died in 1925, most of his inheritance was already gone. By around 1907, barely 30 years after the Commodore's death, Not a single Vanderbilt ranked among the wealthiest people in America any longer. Names like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Ford had all passed them by. The fortune that had taken one ferryman's son a lifetime to build was being spent faster than anyone could track, by people who never learned how it had actually been made. The family's physical monuments went down right along with the money. Those marble palaces along Fifth Avenue, the ones that had once announced a dynasty built to last forever, were bulldozed one after another as the family lost the ability to afford them. By 1947, the last of the great Vanderbilt Fifth Avenue mansions was gone, replaced by ordinary office buildings and shops. The Newport cottages survived a bit longer, but not because the family chose to keep them. One of them, the Breakers, the grandest of all, was handed to a local preservation society in 1972, which paid a mere $365,000 for a house that had once symbolized the richest family in the world. A nonprofit had to step in and save it instead. Which brings us directly to that particular room back in 1973, when around 120 of the Commodore's own descendants gathered together at Vanderbilt University for the very first large family reunion. 96 years earlier, their shared ancestor had personally been the single richest man in all of America. Now, gathered together in one single room, his combined heirs could not have pooled together even $1 million between all of them. The greatest private fortune the country had ever produced had fully returned to zero, and it had managed to do so without any war, any market crash, or any actual crime involved. It had simply been spent and divided by people who had never bothered building the proper machine needed to hold on to it in the first place. Now, here's where the story genuinely takes a turn, because not every single branch of this family lost everything. Two of them managed to hold onto real value in two completely different ways, and together they capture the entire lesson buried inside this whole story. The first is a house. Deep within the mountains of North Carolina stands Biltmore, the largest private home ever built in America, constructed during the 1890s by George Vanderbilt, another grandson of the Commodore. For decades, it functioned just like every other Vanderbilt trophy property, a beautiful, elegant money pit. By 1960, it was losing roughly $250,000 a year. Then, finally, one heir did the thing no earlier Vanderbilt had attempted. George's grandson, William Cecil, walked away from a banking career, returned home, and decided he would treat Biltmore as an actual business that needed to earn its own keep. He turned the property into a real enterprise, tours, then a working farm, restaurants, and eventually a winery. The process was slow and humbling. In 1968, Biltmore finally turned its first profit in the family's history. Guess how much? $16.34. Cecil's own comment was that it beat losing $500,000 instead. But that modest $16 proved the property could stand on its own. Today, Biltmore brings in more than $200 million a year, draws well over 1 million visitors, and remains owned by the Vanderbilt family, now into its fifth generation. Cecil's philosophy became the guiding creed for that branch, the exact opposite of everything the earlier spending generations believed. "We do not preserve Biltmore in order to make a profit," he once said. "We make a profit in order to preserve Biltmore." The second person who kept something valuable did so by keeping almost nothing in the way of actual inherited money. Remember Reginald, the great-grandson who gambled and drank his own share away, dead at 45? Reginald had a daughter named Gloria Vanderbilt, and Gloria grew up famous as something of a poor little rich girl born into a family whose remaining riches were already draining away around her. But Gloria did something none of the earlier palace builders had ever bothered doing. She went out and got to work. She built her own name and her own fortune in fashion and design, based purely on her own effort rather than any inheritance. That alone made her a genuine oddity in this family. For 4 straight generations, the Vanderbilts had largely been people that money simply happened to. Gloria became a Vanderbilt who actually went out and earned her own, eventually putting her name on a line of blue jeans that sold by the millions, building a design business that genuinely belonged to her alone. And Gloria had a son. His name is Anderson Cooper, the news anchor and the great-great-great-grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt, the once richest man in America. Here is what Anderson Cooper himself has publicly said about the family fortune. He says there simply isn't one left, not for him. Speaking publicly a few years back, he put it in plain terms. His mother, he explained, made clear to him early on that there was no trust fund waiting for him. None of that. "I do not believe in inheriting money," he has said. He has referred to a large inheritance as something close to an initiative killer, even a curse. If he had grown up believing there was some pot of gold waiting for him, he said, he honestly doesn't believe he would have felt motivated to accomplish much of anything at all. Sit with that for a moment. The direct descendant of the man who built the single greatest private fortune in American history, technically the heir to something once worth roughly $200 billion, says the best thing that ever happened to him was that the money was already gone by the time he arrived, because If it had still been sitting there, it might have ruined him too, the same way it ruined so many earlier Vanderbilts before him. He isn't performing false humility here. He's stating a pattern he personally watched play out across his own family bloodline for roughly 100 years. The Vanderbilts, who were handed fortunes outright, ended up spending them completely and vanishing, every one of them, eventually landing in that nearly millionaire-less room back in 1973. The branch that treated their inheritance like an actual working business kept it and grew it across 5 generations. And the heir, who inherited essentially nothing and had to build his own life from scratch, ended up genuinely grateful the family curse skipped right past him. In the end, it was never really about the size of the original fortune. It was about whether anyone in the following generations actually built something sound enough to hold on to that wealth, and whether the people who inherited it ever learned to build something of their own. The Astors, the very family that let the Vanderbilts into elite society, dissolved almost exactly the same way, across almost exactly the same span of years. The wealthiest family of their era, gone. 2 dynasties, 1 identical autopsy. They built palaces instead of lasting machines and raised heirs who knew how to spend a fortune, but not one who knew how to keep one intact. The richest man in America gave his family exactly 1 instruction before he died: keep it together. It turned out to be the one thing they were never able to do. And the final word belongs to the one Vanderbilt who never received a single penny of that original fortune and is genuinely glad it worked out that way. There's no pot of gold, Anderson Cooper once said, and losing it turned out to be the very thing that made him.